The silent embrace, God's comfort in the void of loss. There's a moment after loss when the world no longer sounds the same. The air feels heavier, familiar rooms seem larger, and silence becomes something alive, almost physical. It's as if time itself hesitates, unwilling to move forward while your soul stands suspended between what was and what no longer is. In that fragile pause, something sacred happens, though it often hides beneath the weight of our pain. It's the space where heaven bends closer, quietly, invisibly, to hold what words can't reach. Grief is not chaos without purpose. It's the nervous system of love still searching for where to send its signals. The brain, as Andrew Huberman explains, reacts to emotional loss much like the body reacts to physical injury. Circuits of attachment fire in confusion, dopamine levels fall, and the body instinctively seeks safety. Yet beneath the confusion, something divine begins to stir. A kind of sacred recalibration that teaches us how to exist inside emptiness without being consumed by it. God's comfort doesn't always roar through miracles. Sometimes it whispers through neurobiology. The silence that follows loss isn't punishment. It's God rebuilding the architecture of your attention. When we lose someone we love, our perception collapses inward, forcing us to see the world not as it was but as it truly is, fragile, finite, sacred. It's here that the soul begins its apprenticeship in awareness. Judith Beck would call this the restructuring of thought. The Stoics might call it acceptance. Both point to the same truth. Healing begins when we stop trying to fill the silence and start listening to it. As time slows, the mind oscillates between memory and faith. One moment, you're clinging to the past. The next, you're trying to imagine a future that doesn't hurt. That tension is the birthplace of transformation. Neuroscience and spirituality converge here, in this strange middle ground where the brain's adaptation meets the spirit's surrender. Joe Dispenza often describes this as the rewiring of consciousness, the moment when the mind stops repeating the story of loss and begins writing the language of rebirth. But how do we find God in the void? How do we trust a presence that remains unseen, a comfort that arrives without sound? The journey begins when we stop demanding that God explain the silence and instead allow Him to inhabit it. For it's in that stillness, beyond words and certainty, that the invisible embrace begins. The following exploration is not about escaping grief, but understanding it. The neuroscience behind faith, the philosophy within pain, the divine whisper that teaches us how to breathe again when life feels unbearable. This is the anatomy of spiritual stillness, the unspoken language of God in the space where everything else has fallen away. Now that your heart has felt the hush of that sacred quiet, we begin our first chapter, the moment when sound itself disappears and the soul begins to awaken within the silence. When the world stops making sound, it happens without warning. One moment, life hums with ordinary rhythm, and the next, everything stops. The clock keeps moving, but you no longer feel part of it. The silence that follows loss is not the absence of sound, it's the absence of belonging. It's that hollow space between one heartbeat and the next, where reality folds in on itself. The phone that used to ring now sits still, the chair once occupied remains untouched, and every familiar sound becomes an echo of what used to be. In that quiet, the mind searches desperately for meaning, as if the right thought could undo what happened. But the truth is, grief begins when the world loses its voice. And that's exactly where God begins to whisper. In this strange, disorienting silence, the body and mind move into survival mode. Neuroscience shows that our brain reacts to deep emotional pain as if it were physical trauma. The amygdala fires constantly, scanning for safety where none can be found. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought, becomes clouded by emotion. The nervous system trembles between fight and freeze, unable to make sense of the loss. Andrew Huberman explains that this biological chaos isn't a sign of weakness. It's the brain's way of protecting itself, slowing down perception to prevent emotional overload. What feels like numbness is not emptiness, it's divine anesthesia. It's God shielding the soul until it's ready to feel again. The silence after loss can feel unbearable because it exposes the mind's deepest craving: control. Descartes believed that the act of thinking proved existence, but in grief, thought only deepens confusion. You try to reason with pain, to label it, to solve it, but pain doesn't answer to logic. It speaks another language entirely, one of surrender. When the world goes quiet, the intellect meets its limit, and the heart becomes the only instrument capable of hearing what the mind cannot translate. That's when the soul begins to notice what's beneath the surface, the subtle presence that doesn't speak, but somehow feels alive. Judith Beck might call this the turning point of cognition, the shift from external control to internal acceptance. The moment when the question changes from "why did this happen?" to "what is this silence trying to teach me?" It's here, in the tension between resistance and surrender, that spiritual awareness begins. The Stoics taught that loss doesn't destroy us, it reveals us. Seneca wrote that grief is the proof of love's endurance, the evidence that we are capable of connection beyond time. The silence isn't punishment. It's proof that something eternal has been touched. You may find yourself sitting in a room that once felt alive, now heavy with memory. Every object reminds you of the one who's gone. The mind wants to escape, but the body stays. This is the laboratory of transformation, where emotion and physiology collide. The vagus nerve tightens, the breath shortens, and every muscle holds a memory. Yet it's in that same body that God begins his quiet work. As you slow your breath, even unknowingly, you begin to signal to your nervous system that you are safe enough to feel again. This is how faith moves through the flesh, not as magic, but as biology guided by grace. Joe Dispenza describes this as neuroplasticity in motion, the process by which thought, emotion, and faith reshape the structure of the brain. Every act of stillness, every tear allowed, every memory faced, becomes a new pathway of awareness. The brain learns to hold both pain and peace at once. Over time, this duality becomes strength. You begin to realize that silence is not your enemy. It is the environment where God rebuilds your capacity to trust. There comes a moment when you stop fighting the quiet. You start to hear things you hadn't before, the rhythm of your own breath, the faint hum of life continuing outside your grief, the soft pulse of hope buried beneath exhaustion. It's subtle, but it's there. The stillness that once felt like a void starts to feel like a presence. And maybe that's the mystery. God doesn't rush to fill the silence because he is the silence, the still space holding everything that remains. So when the world stops making sound, when you find yourself suspended between heartbreak and healing, remember this: silence is not a punishment to endure, it's a sanctuary to enter. It's the first language of renewal, the threshold between what has ended and what has yet to begin. God's comfort rarely announces itself. It simply waits, quietly, in the same space where everything seems to have fallen apart. And if you dare to listen, you might find that what you thought was absence was, all along, the sound of divine nearness, the language of absence. Loss teaches a language no one wants to learn, a dialect of silence, ache, and unanswered questions. It begins the moment you realize the world keeps moving, indifferent to the space that has opened inside you. You wake up in the same bed, but everything feels rearranged. You look for the person, the presence, the sound that anchored you, and instead you find air, vast, unresponsive, infinite. At first, the emptiness feels cruel, like God has withdrawn his voice. But over time, you start to understand that absence itself speaks. It's not punishment. It's communication beyond words, the soul's way of hearing what can't be said aloud. The language of absence is subtle. It doesn't arrive with answers, but with sensations. The sudden warmth in a quiet room, the memory that surfaces when you least expect it, the calm that appears in the middle of tears. These are not coincidences. They're divine syntax. They form the alphabet of comfort that God uses when speech no longer reaches you. Science might call it pattern recognition, the brain's way of creating coherence from chaos. But faith calls it presence disguised as stillness. Both are true. Andrew Huberman explains that the human mind is wired to seek connection even in silence, that our brains are meaning-making machines, unable to exist in pure void. So when we encounter absence, the mind starts reaching beyond the material world. It's in that reaching that God meets us. When you lose someone, your nervous system rebels. Every habit, every routine, every source of safety gets rewritten. Joe Dispenza would describe it as a neurological collapse. The brain's internal map no longer matches the external world, but this collapse isn't destruction. It's sacred reprogramming. The neurons that once fired in the rhythm of love now begin searching for something larger than human attachment. In the stillness, the brain begins to construct new meaning, and the spirit learns to listen in a new frequency, one that vibrates not with sound, but with awareness. Absence becomes an initiation into perception. You start to feel God, not as an idea, but as a field that holds everything together. René Descartes believed that doubt was the foundation of truth. In loss, doubt takes on a divine form. You doubt the fairness of life, the kindness of God, even your own ability to continue. But beneath that doubt lies an invitation to question not reality, but the way you've known it. The silence asks, what if what you've lost is not gone but transformed? What if the void isn't empty but full of something too vast for the senses to translate? Philosophy meets faith here, where logic ends and awareness begins. The Stoics called this acceptance of reality as it is, not because it's easy, but because resisting it creates more suffering. Seneca wrote that what the gods take from us, they often replace with understanding. The silence of loss is not the absence of God, it's the reshaping of the relationship. You move from speaking to listening, from asking to noticing. And in that shift, the relationship doesn't end, it evolves. The person you lost doesn't vanish. They change form. Their voice echoes not through words but through intuition, coincidence, and grace. The divine remains, but now it speaks through absence. Judith Beck's cognitive approach would say that the mind, when faced with loss, constructs new beliefs to survive. The first belief, they're gone, hurts the most. But the next one, they still live through me, heals what the first broke. Each time you choose awareness over despair, you teach your brain that absence isn't void, it's space. And in that space, new faith begins to breathe. So maybe this is the secret. God doesn't always fill the silence because he wants you to learn to speak his language. A language that exists beyond sound, beyond logic, beyond form. It's the language of memory, intuition, and peace. The one you hear not with your ears but with your whole being. When the presence you loved becomes invisible, it doesn't mean it's gone. It simply means it has entered a dimension where it can be everywhere at once, especially in the quiet you were trying to escape. And in that quiet, if you stay long enough, you'll begin to understand. The silence that once felt unbearable begins to pulse with meaning. The absence that once felt like loss becomes revelation. The space that once hurt the most becomes the very place where God begins to dwell. The heart's hidden laboratory. Inside the chest, beneath the ribs and the ache, there's an unseen laboratory where faith and biology meet. It's the place where the soul experiments with survival, where pain becomes the raw material for transformation. After loss, the heart doesn't simply break, it reconfigures. It learns a new rhythm, one that beats in dialogue with eternity. Every throb becomes an experiment in endurance, a test of how much meaning a human being can rebuild from the ruins of love. Neuroscience reveals that grief isn't just emotional, it's physiological. The brain and body react as if wounded. Dopamine and oxytocin, the chemicals of love and connection, plummet. The amygdala lights up with alarm, while the prefrontal cortex, the center of logic and planning, grows foggy. The result is confusion, fatigue, disorientation, but within this neurological chaos lies divine design. Andrew Huberman's studies show that the brain's plasticity, its ability to change, is most active during moments of deep emotional rupture. That means heartbreak, as unbearable as it feels, is also the most potent doorway for renewal. The mind doesn't just survive loss, it rebuilds itself from it, neuron by neuron, belief by belief. Joe Dispenza would call this the process of spiritual neurogenesis, the creation of new neural pathways that align with higher consciousness. When you sit in grief and begin to breathe through it, you're not only healing emotionally, You're literally rewiring your nervous system. The parasympathetic system, responsible for calm and restoration, begins to reactivate. Slowly, the body learns safety again. This process mirrors faith itself. Just as neurons reconnect through repetition and openness, faith reconnects through surrender and awareness. Both are acts of creation born from emptiness. In moments of deep sorrow, it may feel like your mind is betraying you, replaying memories, flooding you with images you can't control. But those memories are not traps, they're data. The heart's hidden laboratory uses them as samples, testing each for meaning, extracting lessons, distilling love into wisdom. Judith Beck would describe this as cognitive restructuring, the slow, deliberate shift from "I cannot survive this" to "I am learning what this pain is teaching me." The heart, like the brain, reorganizes around new truths, and those truths become architecture for strength. The Stoics understood this long before science. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. When the heart is wounded, its thoughts bleed too. But through reflection and through the quiet observation of pain without judgment, those thoughts begin to purify. You start to realize that grief isn't the end of love, but its transformation. It refines love into something more stable, less dependent on physical presence, more attuned to the eternal. In this laboratory of healing, silence becomes a catalyst. Each breath taken consciously is an experiment in faith. You inhale pain, exhale surrender. Over time, something shifts, not just emotionally, but chemically. Cortisol, the hormone of stress, begins to recede. The nervous system finds rhythm in stillness. What began as agony becomes adaptation. This is where science meets grace, in the proof that the human body is built to heal, not just to endure. Descartes once sought certainty in thought, believing that doubt itself was proof of existence. But grief reveals something deeper. Feeling is the truest evidence of being alive. The ache in your chest, the tears that come unbidden. These are not signs of weakness. They're the experiments of the soul, proving that life continues within you, even when it has ended outside you. In the divine equation, loss is not subtraction, it's transformation. The heart learns to contain both pain and peace at once, expanding in capacity rather than collapsing in defeat. There comes a day when you realize that the pain has changed shape. It's quieter now, less of a wound, more of a scar, and that scar hums with wisdom. You no longer seek to erase the memory, you seek to honor it. The laboratory has done its work. The chemicals have shifted, the neurons have grown, and the heart has evolved into something larger than before. The silence, once unbearable, has become instruction. Grief is not a disease to cure, but a curriculum to complete. Every tear, every moment of numbness, every flicker of gratitude in the dark, they are the sacred experiments through which the human spirit becomes divine in its endurance. In the hidden laboratory of the heart, God is not an observer. He is the scientist working through your every breath, rewriting your biology in the language of grace. When faith feels like falling, there comes a moment in every journey through grief when faith itself begins to tremble. The beliefs that once carried you with certainty suddenly feel fragile, too small to hold the weight of what's happened. The verses that once brought comfort sound distant, abstract, almost foreign. It's not disbelief that visits you, it's exhaustion. You're not doubting God, you're trying to reconcile His silence with your pain. That's the moment when faith stops being an idea and becomes an experience, when it's no longer about what you think, but about what you're willing to feel without understanding. Faith feels like falling because it requires the same surrender as gravity. You let go of your need to grasp what cannot be held, and you allow yourself to descend into something larger, unseen, and unexplainable. For many, this descent feels like abandonment, but it's actually the first act of trust. Andrew Huberman often says that the brain's instinct, when overwhelmed by uncertainty, is to cling to patterns, to predict, to analyze, to control. Yet loss dismantles every pattern. It strips you bare of predictability, leaving you face to face with the unknown. And here, in that vast unknown, faith is born not from knowing, but from continuing. Joe Dispenza calls this the space of creation, the void between what was and what will be. The moment when your old self has died, but the new one has not yet formed. It feels like floating without ground beneath you. The mind resists this, craving structure, explanation, logic, but the soul knows that this emptiness is necessary. Like a seed buried beneath the soil, you cannot grow without first disappearing from view. Faith is the courage to remain in that unseen process, to keep breathing when nothing makes sense, to believe in movement even when everything appears still. In cognitive therapy, Judith Beck teaches that the thoughts we attach to determine how we suffer. This pain means I'm alone leads to despair, while this pain means I am human opens a door to compassion. The difference lies in perspective. When faith feels like falling, it's the mind detaching from control so the heart can take the lead. That's where emotional resilience begins, not in fighting the fall, but in trusting that something will catch you. The Stoics understood this dance between surrender and strength. Seneca wrote that the greatest test of the soul is to trust in the divine, even when the outcome is hidden. They viewed hardship not as proof of God's absence, but as evidence of his confidence in our capacity to endure. Marcus Aurelius believed that what happens to us is not what defines us. It's how we align our thoughts with truth in response to it. Faith, in this sense, is not passive acceptance. It's active alignment. It's saying, I don't understand this, but I will not let it define the end of me. Descartes once sought truth through doubt, and perhaps faith requires the same courage. To doubt not because you've lost belief, but because you're brave enough to seek something deeper than inherited certainty. The fall of faith is actually its rebirth. It's the transition from religion as comfort to spirituality as experience. It's moving from God will fix this to God is in this. The pain doesn't vanish. Instead, it becomes illuminated from within. There's a moment, often unnoticed, when the fall starts to feel less like descent and more like release. The muscles unclench, the breath steadies, and for the first time, the silence stops feeling hostile. You sense that you're not falling alone. Something invisible is falling with you, cushioning the descent. That's grace, not the loud, triumphant kind, but the subtle one that appears like light behind closed eyes. It's the recognition that even in the absence of answers, presence remains. Over time, faith redefines itself. It stops being about evidence and starts being about endurance. It becomes quieter, steadier, deeper. You realize that faith was never meant to prevent the fall. It was meant to teach you how to land, gently, humbly, and aware that the ground you feared was always holy. When everything else collapses, faith remains the pulse that keeps the soul alive, even when the heart feels shattered. So when you find yourself falling, don't resist. Let yourself descend into the unknown, for it's there that God waits, not above demanding belief, but beneath, holding the place where you'll land. The fall is not the end of faith. It's where faith finally begins to breathe on its own. The weight of the invisible hand. There are moments when comfort doesn't arrive in words, but in sensations you can't explain. The quiet intuition that keeps you standing when you have no strength left. The unplanned meeting that brings an unexpected sense of peace. The dream that feels more real than waking life. These are not accidents. They are the fingerprints of an invisible hand, guiding you through the fog that grief creates. It's not something you can see or prove. It's something you can feel in the marrow of your being. This is how divine comfort often appears, disguised as coincidence, clothed in timing, carried by ordinary people who unknowingly become vessels of grace. Andrew Huberman's research reveals that the human nervous system is designed to respond to connection even in the absence of words. When someone touches your shoulder, when a friend listens without interrupting, when you cry and someone simply stays, oxytocin rises, cortisol drops, and your body begins to stabilize. You don't need a sermon, you need presence. This is what the invisible hand feels like. It doesn't always lift you out of pain, it regulates you through it. God works within the body's chemistry as much as He works within the heart's faith. Divine intervention sometimes is just the brain rewiring itself toward hope. Joe Dispenza explains that the universe often mirrors our state of consciousness. When you shift from despair to openness, even slightly, new experiences begin to align around that vibration. It's not magic, It's magnetism, the natural order responding to your internal state. The invisible hand doesn't force you forward. It responds to movement. It's the unseen intelligence of life that guides you one step at a time, always waiting for your willingness to believe that healing is possible. In that sense, faith becomes collaboration, not passivity but participation in grace. There's something extraordinary about the way divine timing operates. You think you're walking through random moments, but each one fits together with precision. A song comes on when you need it. A stranger says something that feels meant for you. A line in a book pierces through your numbness like a whisper from heaven. These aren't proof that you're being watched from afar. They're reminders that you've never been outside the current of divine order. What you call coincidence is often orchestration too intricate for the intellect to track. Descartes sought certainty through logic, but here logic yields to awe. Faith doesn't require that you understand the hand, only that you trust its touch. Judith Beck would say that healing begins with the smallest shifts in cognition, moments when new meaning is allowed to exist beside pain. That's precisely how grace works. The invisible hand doesn't erase your suffering, it reframes it. It teaches you to reinterpret events not as punishment, but as participation in something greater. When you allow that reinterpretation, the brain begins to rewire itself around gratitude instead of fear. And gratitude, neurologically, is incompatible with despair. It doesn't cancel pain, but it changes your relationship to it. The Stoics knew this truth intuitively. Seneca wrote that the divine hand doesn't protect us from storms, it teaches us to navigate them. Marcus Aurelius believed that fate and providence were not enemies of freedom, but expressions of order we can't yet see. When you begin to see the invisible hand at work, you stop feeling like a victim of circumstance. You begin to feel like a participant in design. Every hardship becomes a thread in a larger tapestry, one you may not yet understand, but can sense is leading somewhere necessary. Sometimes the invisible hand appears through loss itself. The loved one who's gone, you can't see them, but you can feel their presence in subtle ways. The sudden calm that appears when you speak their name, the moment you almost hear their laughter in the wind. It's as if love refuses to obey physical boundaries. Physics and theology intersect here. Energy cannot be destroyed, only transformed. The essence of those we love remains just beyond perception, folded into the unseen layers of the world. The hand that once held yours may now move through air, through intuition, through peace that comes when you least expect it. And when you start recognizing these moments, something within you softens. You realize you're not alone in the reconstruction of your soul. The invisible hand doesn't erase the pain, but it steadies the heart that carries it. You start to notice how every quiet mercy, every small coincidence, every act of kindness forms a constellation of guidance that lights the way forward. God rarely shouts over the noise of our grief. He moves through subtler means, timing, nature, strangers, dreams, sensations, all speaking in the same language of mercy. The invisible hand may not remove your burdens, but it teaches you how to carry them differently, lighter, with meaning, with grace. You may not see where it's leading, but one day when you look back, you'll realize that every step, every silence, and every ache was already being held. The soul's echo in the nervous system. There's a mystery within the body that few notice until pain forces them to listen. It's the realization that the soul and the nervous system speak the same language, one through emotion, the other through electricity. Every pulse of fear, every sigh of relief, every trembling breath is not just biological activity, it's communication between the visible and the invisible. When grief enters the body, it doesn't knock politely. It floods. The heart races, the chest tightens, sleep fractures, and the body begins to echo the mind's chaos. You think you're simply sad, but what's really happening is that your entire being is trying to recalibrate its connection with life. Andrew Huberman describes this as the brain's internal orchestra, a complex harmony between the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. When we lose someone, the balance collapses. Adrenaline surges, cortisol stays high, and the body remains in alert mode, waiting for something that will never return. The nervous system cannot distinguish between physical and emotional danger. so it reacts to loss as if it's a threat that must be survived. This is why grief feels like exhaustion and restlessness at once, the mind begging for stillness while the body refuses to rest. But what if this physiological storm is not betrayal but divine adaptation? What if the trembling is the body's prayer, a way of asking for peace? The beauty of human design is that the same system capable of breaking under pain is also built for recovery. Slow breathing, stillness, silence. These are not just coping mechanisms. They are recalibration signals. Each deep exhale activates the vagus nerve, sending messages of safety throughout the body. Over time, these signals begin to rebuild the bridge between emotion and faith. Science calls it self-regulation. Spirituality calls it surrender. Both describe the same movement, the gradual synchronization of body and soul until the storm quiets into a rhythm of grace. Joe Dispenza teaches that every emotion has an electromagnetic signature, and when we practice gratitude or prayer, the body generates coherence, measurable harmony between the heart and brain. This coherence isn't imagined, it's recorded. It's the physiology of faith. In those moments of stillness, when you close your eyes and whisper, "God, help me," something measurable happens. Heart rate steadies, brain waves slow, cortisol drops, and oxytocin rises. It's as if the entire body recognizes divine presence before the mind does. God doesn't just comfort the spirit. He rewires the nervous system to feel that comfort physically. Judith Beck might describe this as the merging of cognitive awareness and bodily truth, the point where your thoughts begin to honor what your body has known all along. The nervous system doesn't lie. It carries every experience like a sacred archive. Each heartbreak, each act of forgiveness, each moment of surrender is stored not just in memory, but in muscle, breath, and heartbeat. Healing, then, isn't about forgetting pain. It's about teaching the body a new way to remember it. Through mindfulness, prayer, movement, and rest, you teach your cells that peace is safe again. The Stoics believed that the body is the servant of the soul, yet they also knew the soul listens through the body. Marcus Aurelius often meditated on breath as the meeting point between the human and the divine. Every inhale draws in the life force. Every exhale releases attachment. Modern neuroscience simply gives language to this ancient truth, that peace is not found in thought alone, but in the body's rhythm aligning with trust. You can't think your way out of pain. You have to breathe your way through it. There's a quiet moment that arrives after many tears, when you feel something shift, not dramatically but softly, like a string being retuned. Your heart still aches, but it's no longer frantic. The pulse steadies, your body feels grounded, and you realize that healing has already begun. Not because you've figured anything out, but because your nervous system has finally remembered that you're still alive. This moment is sacred. It's the intersection where faith becomes physiology, where grace becomes measurable. The soul's echo in the nervous system is God's way of reminding you that divinity isn't somewhere beyond the stars. It's woven into your biology. Every beat, every tear, every breath is both human and holy. When you sit in silence and allow your body to rest, you are participating in creation itself, recalibrating the harmony between spirit and flesh. You are becoming a living translation of grace, written in the language of the nervous system. So the next time your heart races, your breath shortens, or your body trembles under grief, don't curse the reaction. Listen to it. The trembling is not weakness, it's a form of prayer. It's your body crying out for peace, and peace patiently answering back, fractures that let the light in. There is a moment, somewhere in the long corridor of grief, when the pain begins to reveal its true nature. At first, it feels like destruction, the collapse of everything that once gave life meaning. But as the dust of heartbreak begins to settle, something delicate appears inside the wreckage. Light. Not the blinding light of revelation, but a fragile glow, almost shy. It leaks through the fractures in your heart, the ones you thought had ruined you. This light isn't new. It was always there, hidden beneath layers of certainty, pride, and control. Loss didn't bring it into existence, it simply broke open the walls that kept it from shining through. Pain has a strange intelligence. It doesn't come only to wound, it comes to expose. Neuroscience teaches that the human brain, when faced with suffering, enters a state of heightened neuroplasticity. In other words, pain makes us more malleable, more capable of change. Andrew Huberman would call this the biological opening, a window during which new patterns of perception can form. Grief, then, is not just emotional devastation, it's a neurological invitation. It forces us to see differently, to think differently, to exist differently. The mind, once rigid in its definitions of love and meaning, becomes porous again, receptive to transformation. Joe Dispenza would describe this as the collapse of the old self, the dissolution of the personality shaped by comfort, predictability, and attachment. When everything breaks, what's truly essential begins to rise. The false layers, fear, pride, illusion, fall away. What remains is awareness, raw and unguarded. That's the birthplace of light. The pain that once felt unbearable becomes the fire that forges resilience, and the emptiness that once terrified you becomes the silence through which divine wisdom speaks. In cognitive terms, Judith Beck would say that fractures invite reframing. Every time you challenge the thought, "This pain will destroy me," and replace it with, "This pain is revealing me," your brain begins to form new synaptic connections aligned with hope. It's not about denying the hurt, it's about discovering what exists within it. You start to realize that the light doesn't arrive after the darkness, it's born within it. Like a seed cracking open underground, the breaking is the beginning of life, not its end. The Stoics understood this truth centuries ago. Seneca wrote that adversity introduces a person to themselves. Marcus Aurelius reflected that fire turns everything thrown into it into fuel. Loss in this way becomes alchemy, the sacred chemistry that transforms sorrow into strength. The mind might interpret pain as punishment, but the soul recognizes it as purification. Descartes would have searched for logic, but even he might have paused here, where philosophy meets mystery, and understood that pain carries an intelligence reason cannot measure. In those quiet hours when the world feels distant and you feel too broken to continue, notice how your perception shifts. You begin to see beauty in simplicity, the way sunlight spills through a window, the rhythm of your own breathing, the quiet mercy of another day beginning. You're not seeing new things, you're seeing with new eyes. The fracture has expanded your capacity for awe. You understand that everything fragile, love, memory, even your own faith, is made luminous by its impermanence. The light that enters through your wounds doesn't erase the cracks, it defines them. They become sacred scars, symbols of a life touched by both sorrow and divinity. Neuroscience would call this resilience, the nervous system learning that safety can exist alongside sadness. Faith calls it grace, the invisible hand steadying you from within. Both are true. The brokenness doesn't vanish, it becomes translucent, allowing light to move freely through what was once solid. And in that transparency, you begin to sense something extraordinary. God never left the shattered pieces. He was the light pressing against them all along. The pain that broke you open was the very force that allowed you to perceive His presence. Every fracture became a window, every tear a reflection, every scar a story of light, finding its way through flesh and time. You don't heal by returning to who you were, you heal by becoming who you were meant to be all along. The cracks are not flaws, they are features of transformation. They are the precise openings through which love, awareness, and faith flow into being. When you finally stop trying to mend yourself back to perfection and instead let the light pass through you freely, you discover what healing truly means. Not the erasure of pain, but the sanctification of it. So when you look at your brokenness, don't hide it. Hold it to the light and watch how it glows. Because the truth is simple, powerful, and timeless. What breaks you also remakes you. And through every fracture, God finds another way in. The conversation beneath thought. There's a kind of silence that doesn't mean emptiness. It means presence that words cannot hold. Beneath the surface noise of the mind, beyond the rehearsed prayers and circular worries, There exists a space where the soul begins to listen instead of speak. That's the conversation beneath thought, the dialogue between you and God that takes place in stillness, in awareness, in the places that logic cannot reach. It's not spoken through language, but through perception, feeling, intuition, and quiet knowing. The moment you stop filling silence with words, you begin to hear what was always waiting underneath. A whisper that doesn't command, but comforts, doesn't instruct, but reveals. Andrew Huberman's research shows that when the brain enters states of deep stillness, the kind found in meditation or contemplative prayer, neural activity shifts from the prefrontal cortex to more integrative networks like the default mode. This shift allows the brain to connect distant regions, linking emotion, memory, and creativity. What this means in spiritual terms is that the quiet mind becomes a bridge. When thought ceases, awareness expands. This is not the absence of thinking, it's the awakening of consciousness. You begin to perceive not as a thinker, but as a participant in something much larger. The boundaries between self and divine begin to blur. Joe Dispenza often describes this state as the space between. When you close your eyes, breathe, and allow yourself to simply be, your brain waves descend from the fast analytical beta state into alpha and theta, the frequencies of intuition, healing, and creation. This is where you encounter the sacred not as belief, but as experience. The mind quiets and suddenly you feel life moving through you instead of around you. You're no longer seeking God, you're sensing Him, as if the air itself carries intelligence. You realize that this stillness, which once felt like absence, is actually dialogue, not verbal, but vibrational. René Descartes once sought proof of existence through reason. I think, therefore I am. But in this depth of silence, a new awareness emerges. I am, therefore I hear. Existence no longer needs to be proven through analysis, it is known through presence. In that space beneath thought, the voice of God isn't heard as an external sound. It's felt as a recognition that everything around you is alive, responsive, interconnected. The Stoics called this the Logos, the divine reason that orders the universe, the harmony beneath apparent chaos. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the universe is change and life is opinion, meaning that peace begins when we stop resisting what is and start perceiving it as part of a larger rhythm. Judith Beck's cognitive principles align with this truth. Beneath the noise of automatic thoughts lies a core belief that defines our emotional world. When you quiet the chatter, you uncover that belief, often one that says, I am alone, I am unworthy, or I am broken. Yet in this sacred silence, those beliefs begin to dissolve. The body calms, the breath deepens, and what remains is a simpler truth. I am still here. This moment of awareness is healing in itself because it reconnects the mind to the body to the soul, and the soul to everything beyond it. The conversation beneath thought is not a mystical escape. It's a return to the part of you that existed before fear learned to speak. The Stoics practiced this through reflective solitude, allowing the mind to release judgment until only clarity remained. Neuroscience now shows that such practices literally reorganize the brain, strengthening pathways of compassion, patience, and resilience. In stillness, the nervous system begins to regulate itself. Cortisol drops, the heart rate steadies, and oxytocin, the molecule of trust and connection, rises. In other words, silence is not inactivity, it's biochemical transformation. It's divine dialogue written in physiology. There's a moment when you begin to feel a deep knowing, not a thought, not an idea, but a resonance. You understand something without needing to articulate it. That's the voice of God. It doesn't interrupt, it integrates. It doesn't demand obedience, it invites awareness. It's the same intelligence that guides the tides, heals the body, and whispers peace in the middle of despair. When you reach this depth of listening, you begin to realize that prayer was never about asking, it was about remembering. And so, beneath thought, the real conversation begins. You stop seeking signs and start recognizing patterns. You stop chasing answers and start noticing presence. The mind, once loud and anxious, becomes transparent. allowing divine wisdom to move freely through it. You realize that you were never waiting for God to speak. He was waiting for you to be still enough to hear. This is the conversation that changes everything. It doesn't erase pain, but it translates it. It turns suffering into understanding, fear into faith, silence into revelation. Beneath thought, there are no arguments, no conditions, no noise, only awareness, only love, only truth. And when you learn to dwell there, even for a moment, you never hear the world the same way again. Rebuilding the house of the soul. When loss strikes, it doesn't just take someone or something away. It dismantles the architecture of who you thought you were. Every belief, habit, and attachment that once formed the foundation of your identity begins to crumble. What used to feel solid now feels uncertain. The walls of familiarity collapse, and suddenly, you are standing in the ruins of your own inner home. This moment is terrifying because it feels like there's nothing left to hold on to. But hidden within the debris is a quiet truth. Destruction is not the end of the story. It's the clearing before reconstruction. The soul doesn't remain shattered forever. It rebuilds itself, brick by brick, into something wiser, truer, and unshakably alive. Neuroscience tells us that the brain rewires itself continuously. Andrew Huberman describes this adaptability, neuroplasticity, as the foundation of recovery. Each thought, each choice, each act of courage rewrites neural patterns. When you begin to rise after loss, even in the smallest ways, getting out of bed, taking a walk, choosing to breathe deeply, your brain takes notice. It starts to create new associations, forming networks of resilience and meaning where despair once ruled. The rebuilding of the soul mirrors the rebuilding of the mind. Healing isn't a single revelation. It's thousands of tiny repetitions of hope until the system stabilizes into faith again. Joe Dispenza calls this the birth of a new identity. When your old life no longer fits, you are invited, you're forced, to create a new one. You stop living through memory and start living through intention. The past stops defining your boundaries and instead becomes the soil for growth. Every day, as you make new choices, you teach your body that it is safe to exist beyond pain. You are no longer reacting to grief. You are evolving through it. Spiritual rebirth, then, is not about returning to who you were. It's about becoming who the loss prepared you to be. This transformation is rarely graceful. It's messy, raw, inconsistent. Some days you'll feel peace, and others you'll feel like collapsing again. But even the collapses serve a purpose. They remind you that healing is not linear, it's cyclical. Judith Beck would call this the cognitive restructuring process, where setbacks are not failures but data. Each time you face a wave of pain and choose to endure rather than escape, your brain records it as proof that survival is possible. The mind begins to trust itself again. The heart begins to reopen. This is how the new foundation of the soul is laid, not in perfection but in persistence. The Stoics viewed adversity as the ultimate architect of character. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the obstacle becomes the way, meaning that every trial carries within it the blueprint of transformation. Seneca believed that suffering was the forge of virtue. Through this lens, loss is not destruction, but design. The dismantling of comfort reveals the scaffolding of purpose. When everything superficial falls away, what remains is essence, your truest form, unmasked by illusion. You start to understand that pain didn't break you. It rebuilt you according to a higher pattern. René Descartes once tried to rebuild all knowledge from doubt. He stripped away every assumption until only one truth remained. I think, therefore I am. Rebuilding the soul follows a similar pattern. You strip away the beliefs that no longer serve you, that joy is gone forever, that love was lost, that God has turned away, until only one truth remains. I am still here. That awareness is the cornerstone of reconstruction. It's the proof of continuity, the evidence that the divine presence has never left, only changed form. In practical terms, this rebuilding often starts with small rituals. Cleaning a room, walking under sunlight, speaking a prayer not because you believe it fully, but because you need to feel the rhythm of faith again. Every act of order you bring to the outer world begins to organize the inner one. The nervous system stabilizes. The fog begins to lift. You are no longer merely surviving grief. You are participating in creation. You are helping God rebuild the architecture of your life from within. Over time, what once felt like rubble starts to resemble a new foundation. Gratitude returns, not as denial of pain, but as acknowledgement of its sacred purpose. You begin to look at your scars and realize they are not ruins. They are the framework of a cathedral still under construction. The new house of the soul is quieter, humbler, and infinitely stronger. Its walls are not built of certainty, but of awareness. Its roof is not fear of loss, but acceptance of change. Its light comes not from the outside, but from within. One day, without realizing it, you'll find yourself breathing freely again. You'll feel peace, not because the past has been erased, but because it has been integrated. The foundation that once cracked beneath the weight of sorrow has become a temple of resilience, and inside it, you'll hear the faint echo of something eternal. The voice that says, "You were never destroyed. You were being remade." The sound of God's silence. When the storms quiet and the tears finally slow, what remains is something almost unrecognizable. Not the life you had, not the pain that consumed you, but a silence that feels alive. It's a presence that doesn't speak, yet answers every question you never thought could be resolved. This is the sound of God's silence. It isn't the void you feared. It's the completion of every prayer that words could never finish. The silence that once felt cruel, distant, unbearable, slowly begins to feel like companionship. It holds you, surrounds you, breathes with you. You realize that it was never empty. It was full of Him all along. Andrew Huberman might explain that the human brain, when finally released from chronic stress, enters a state of neural coherence. The oscillations between different regions, emotion, thought, perception, begin to synchronize. That synchronization feels like peace. The chaos of grief that once tore your internal world apart begins to align, and the nervous system settles into harmony. Spiritually, this is the same as what mystics have described for centuries, the moment when the soul stops wrestling and begins to rest. You no longer demand explanations from God. You simply allow Him to be where He always was, in the unseen, in the quiet, in the rhythm of your breath. This silence doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. Joe Dispenza would call it integration, the unification of memory and meaning. The brain stops categorizing experiences as pain or joy, and instead begins to register them as wisdom. You no longer ask, "Why did this happen?" but "What has this given me?" That shift changes the chemistry of the body and the geometry of the spirit. Gratitude starts to rise naturally, not as performance, but as perception. You see that what was taken wasn't destruction, it was transformation. God didn't abandon you in silence. He was speaking through it, teaching you how to see without sight, to hear without sound, to trust without proof. Philosophers have long sought to define truth, but perhaps truth is not an equation to solve. It's a presence to feel. Descartes looked for certainty in reason. The Stoics found it in acceptance. Marcus Aurelius wrote that tranquility comes when you align yourself with the rhythm of the universe. The sound of God's silence is that rhythm, the unspoken pulse beneath everything alive. When you listen closely, you hear it everywhere, in wind moving through trees, in your heartbeat, in the breath that leaves your chest and returns without your command. That constancy is the proof of divine companionship. Even when everything else changes, that rhythm remains, unbroken, eternal. Judith Beck might explain this as the final stage of cognitive healing, the point where new beliefs have not only been learned, but internalized. You no longer have to remind yourself to trust. Trust has become part of your nervous system. Your body and mind agree that peace is possible. And in that alignment, you understand that silence was never the absence of communication, it was the clearest form of it. Words could never have reached this depth. Silence was the only language vast enough to contain the love that outlived loss. In time, you begin to hear life differently. Laughter sounds deeper, music feels sacred. Even ordinary sounds, a door closing, a leaf falling, a breath drawn, carry weight, as if every vibration is an echo of creation itself. You sense that all existence hums with the same tone, a divine resonance that connects everything that ever was and ever will be. That's when you realize The silence you once dreaded is not an ending. It's the frequency of eternity. The Stoics would call this serenity. Neuroscientists might call it coherence. But beyond all labels, what it truly is homecoming. You are no longer searching for God in the thunder, in the miracles, in the grand explanations. You have found him in the space between moments, in the pulse between heartbeats, in the still air that asks for nothing and gives everything. You have discovered that silence is not the opposite of sound. It is the foundation upon which all sound rests. And so you sit there, no longer afraid of the quiet. You understand that what you hear now is not nothing. It is the whisper of everything. The sound of God's silence is not empty. It's the sound of love beyond words, of peace beyond logic, of presence beyond form. It's the sound of being held by something that never left. The voice you sought outside of yourself was always waiting inside, speaking in stillness, saying the same simple truth that transcends all understanding. You were never alone.